The first time, I realized my family had erased me. It wasn't at a funeral or during a fight. It was at my younger sister's wedding, standing in the back of a candlelit barn in Napa Valley, watching her walk down the aisle as if I didn't exist. My name is Claire Whitman. I was 31 years old that day, and according to the seating chart printed on thick ivory paper, I was no longer considered immediate family. I remember holding the program in my hands, reading it twice, then a third time, convinced I had missed something. Parents of the bride, parents of the groom, maid of honor, best man. Even my cousin Lily, who barely spoke to anyone, had a role. But there was no mention of me, no sister of the bride, no acknowledgement at all. I stood there quietly, heels sinking slightly into the soft dirt floor, listening to guests whisper about how beautiful everything was. My parents sat in the front row, my mother dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, my father smiling like this was the culmination of everything he'd worked for. My sister Ava looked radiant, calm, certain. I felt like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong celebration. 15 minutes later, when the officiant welcomed everyone and spoke about family commitment and support, I felt something inside me settle. Not break, settle, like a final piece dropping into place. This was not a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. That realization would take years to fully unfold, but that was the moment it began. Growing up, I was the reliable one, the older sister who followed rules, got good grades, stayed quiet. Ava was the spark, the dreamer, the one who needed more attention, more protection. My parents often joked that I was easy, which I learned early on was not a compliment. It meant I required less care, less explanation, less space. When our grandmother Eleanor died, things shifted in ways I didn't understand at the time. She had been the only one who treated us equally. She remembered my birthday without reminders. She asked about my job. She once told me when I was 16 that being observant was a form of strength, that people underestimated quiet women at their own risk. After she passed, my father took over handling everything: the house, the family business, the trust. I wasn't involved. I wasn't invited to the meetings. When I asked questions, I was told not to worry, that everything was taken care of. I believed them for a while. By the time I was 25, I was working as an operations manager at a logistics company in Sacramento. I paid my own rent. I covered my own insurance. I showed up to every family holiday with a gift, in a smile. I never asked for anything. Ava, on the other hand, lived at home until she got engaged. My parents paid for her graduate school, her apartment, her wedding. They said it was temporary help, that things would even out eventually. They never did. The wedding invitation arrived 6 months before the ceremony. Thick envelope, elegant script, my name spelled correctly, which I remember noticing because I was already trained to look for small omissions. I was invited as a guest. No +1, no role, no acknowledgement that I was the bride's sister. I told myself it didn't matter. Weddings were complicated. Maybe Ava wanted a simple ceremony. Maybe she didn't want family drama. But at the rehearsal dinner, when the toasts began, and my father stood up to talk about our family legacy and the daughter who will carry us forward, I felt the air leave my lungs. He never said my name. Later that night, I stood outside by the fire pit, staring into the flames, when my mother came up beside me. She touched my arm lightly, like she was afraid of being seen. "Don't take it personally," she said. That was the first time I realized how deeply conditioned she was to excuse everything. After the wedding, things escalated quietly. Invitations stopped coming. Family decisions were made without me. When my father sold part of the family business, I found out through a mutual acquaintance. When my parents updated their estate plan, Ava was listed as executor. I wasn't mentioned. Still, I didn't confront anyone. I watched. I took notes. I started asking careful questions to people outside the family: lawyers, accountants, former employees of my father's company. What I learned was unsettling. Assets had been moved, accounts consolidated. My grandmother's trust, which I later discovered had named me as a co-beneficiary, had been restructured. Perfectly legal on paper, perfectly invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. I began to understand that what I had always called love was actually control, silence rewarded, compliance expected, independence punished by exclusion. The real betrayal wasn't that they favored Ava. It was that they assumed I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't push back, that I would accept being quietly written out of my own family history. The night after the wedding, alone, in my hotel room, I opened my laptop and searched for estate attorneys in California. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I booked a consultation for the following week because something had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't trying to be included. I was preparing to protect myself, and I didn't yet know it. But the choices I made next would change the balance of power in my family forever. The attorney's office was smaller than I expected. Beige walls framed certificates, a faint smell of old coffee. Nothing about it felt dramatic, which was oddly comforting. I wasn't there to make a scene. I was there to understand what had been taken from me without my consent. His name was Martin Hale, mid-50s, calm voice. The kind of man who listened more than he spoke. I noticed immediately that he didn't interrupt me when I explained why I was there. He let me talk, let me circle the story, the way people do when they're still convincing themselves it's real. When I finished, he folded his hands and asked one question. "Do you know why they think you won't challenge this?" I shook my head. "Because you've never had to," he said. "Families like yours don't rely on force. They rely on patterns." That word stayed with me, patterns. Over the next hour, he explained things I had never been told. How trusts could be amended. How powers of attorney worked. How a signature given during grief could undo decades of intent. How silence was often mistaken for agreement. "What you're describing," he said carefully, "is not uncommon, but it is intentional." I left with a folder and a clarity I hadn't felt in years. From that day on, I stopped asking my parents questions. I stopped trying to be looped in. Instead, I started documenting everything: dates, conversations, emails, holiday exclusions, financial discrepancies, not obsessively, methodically. Thanksgiving came and went without an invitation. My mother texted the morning of something vague, about a small gathering and limited space. I replied with a polite wish and nothing else. Christmas was the same. A photo appeared online of my parents, Ava, her husband Mark, and his parents in front of a massive tree. Matching pajamas, matching smiles. The caption read, "All of us together." I stared at it longer than I should have, then closed the app. I wasn't angry anymore. I was alert. In February, my father called. It was the first time he'd reached out directly in months. "We're thinking of selling the lake house," he said, like he was discussing the weather. The lake house had been my grandmother's pride. She'd told me once she wanted it to stay in the family, and she'd looked directly at me when she said it. "That's your decision," I replied. There was a pause on the line. I could almost hear him recalibrating. "Well," he said, "Ava has some opinions, but we'll handle it." I thanked him for letting me know and ended the call. Then I called Martin. That conversation changed everything. "You have standing," he said, after reviewing the trust documents we'd requested, not just emotionally, legally. Apparently, My grandmother's original trust had named both Ava and me as beneficiaries, with specific language that limited unilateral changes. Those limitations had been softened later, during a period when my mother had been listed as mentally vulnerable following an illness. "They didn't remove you," Martin said. "They buried you." There was a difference. The next few months passed quietly. Too quietly. I attended work. I went to the gym. I had dinner with friends. On the surface, my life looked untouched. But underneath, things were shifting. A certified letter arrived in April. Notice of intent to sell the lake house. Martin smiled when I showed him. "This is where patterns work against them," he said. "They assumed you wouldn't respond." We filed an objection, a formal one, calm, precise, entirely legal. My father called the next day, his voice sharp, with something I hadn't heard before. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded. "I'm not doing anything," I said evenly. "I'm participating." Silence. "You never cared about that place," he said. "That's not true," I replied. "You just stopped asking." He hung up on me. The reaction from my family was swift, but indirect. My mother sent a long email about how hurtful this was. Ava texted that I was embarrassing everyone. Mark added that legal battles were unnecessary stress. I didn't respond. Instead, I let Martin respond. The court date was set for late summer. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no confrontations, just documents, timelines, and the quiet unraveling of a story my family had assumed no one would question. In July, Ava showed up at my apartment unannounced. She looked different, tired, less polished. "We need to talk," she said. I stepped aside and let her in. She walked around my living room like she was trying to find her place in it. Then she turned to me. "Why now?" she asked. "Why couldn't you just let things be?" I considered the question. "Because things only worked for you," I said. She frowned. "That's not fair." "I'm not asking for fair," I replied. "I'm asking for what was promised." Her eyes flickered. For a moment, I thought she might say something honest. Instead, she crossed her arms. "Dad says you're being manipulated." I smiled faintly. "That's interesting." "Why?" "Because the only person who ever tried to teach me how to think critically was Grandma. She left shortly after. No hug, no resolution. But something had cracked. 2 weeks later, Martin called. "They want to settle," he said. I closed my eyes. "On what terms?" I asked. "They're willing to pause the sale and acknowledge your share." It wasn't everything, but it was more than they'd ever intended to give. I told him to counter, not aggressively, precisely. That night, I sat alone on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker on. I thought about all the years I'd mistaken endurance for loyalty, silence for grace, exclusion for peace. I understood now that being easy had cost me everything, and I was done paying that price. The settlement talks dragged on longer than anyone expected, which was exactly how Martin said it would go. Power, he told me, rarely surrendered cleanly. It stalled, it tested, it waited to see who would blink first. I didn't blink. While the lawyers exchanged drafts and counterdrafts, my family went quiet again. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the strategic kind. No calls, no texts, no passive-aggressive emails. It was the silence of people recalculating. I used that time to look backward, not nostalgically, practically. I started pulling together a timeline of my life inside that family. When I'd moved out, when Ava had stayed, who paid for what, who benefited from which decision. I asked myself questions I'd avoided for years. When had I first been excluded? When had my voice stopped mattering? The answer was earlier than I like to admit. It wasn't the wedding, or the holidays, or the trust. It was the year my father asked me to co-sign a loan for the family business. I had been 26, newly promoted, proud of finally having some financial stability. He framed it as temporary. Just paperwork, he said. A formality. Ava wasn't in a position to help. She was too busy starting her life. I'd hesitated. He'd smiled and said, "You're the responsible one." I signed. 6 months later, the loan was refinanced. My name quietly removed. The liability gone, but so was the leverage. At the time, I felt relieved. Now I understood it differently. I'd been useful until I wasn't. That pattern repeated everywhere. Once I knew how to see it. I was consulted when compliance was needed, excluded when outcomes were decided, praised for being low maintenance, punished for having boundaries. Realizing that didn't make me angry. It made me focused. In August, Martin called again. "They've agreed to your counter," he said. "But there's a condition." I leaned back in my chair. Of course there is. They want a family meeting before anything is signed. I laughed once. Short. Humorless. "No," I said immediately. I told them you'd say that, he replied. "But hear me out. The meeting wouldn't be about negotiation. It would be on record, with counsel present." That gave me pause. "Why would I agree to that?" I asked. Because he said carefully, "People like your father rely on narrative. This would limit his ability to rewrite it." I thought about that longer than I expected. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday in a neutral conference room downtown. No home advantage, no emotional territory. Just a long table, a pitcher of water, and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look a little exposed. My parents arrived together. Ava came separately. Mark didn't come at all. My father looked irritated. My mother looked small. Ava looked guarded. Martin sat beside me. Their attorney, a woman named Denise, sat across. No one hugged. No one asked how I was. Denise opened with procedural language. Purpose, scope, expectations. Then my father spoke. "This is unnecessary," he said. "We're family." I didn't respond. He turned to me. "You've made this very difficult." Still nothing. Martin leaned forward. "Claire is exercising her legal rights. Difficulty is not the issue." My father's jaw tightened. Ava shifted in her seat. "You could have just talked to us," she said, looking directly at me now, instead of going straight to lawyers. I met her gaze calmly. "I tried talking," I said. "For years. This is what happens when talking doesn't work." My mother's eyes filled with tears. She reached for a tissue, then folded it in her lap without using it. "We did our best," she whispered. I nodded. "I believe you think that." The room went quiet. Denise cleared her throat. "Let's refocus." The documents were reviewed. Terms outlined. My share formally acknowledged. Limitations placed on future amendments. Transparency clauses added. Everything precise. Everything enforceable. As they talked, I watched my father's face change. The irritation gave way to something closer to disbelief. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. At one point, he leaned back and said, "I don't understand why you're doing this now." I looked at him, because now I have enough distance to see clearly, I said, and enough stability to say no. That landed harder than I expected. The meeting ended without resolution, but with direction. Papers to be revised, another date set. In the hallway afterward, Ava caught up with me. "You're really going through with this," she said. "Yes." She shook her head. "You always do this. You withdraw instead of fighting." I studied her for a moment. "This is me fighting," I said quietly. She didn't respond. That night, alone in my apartment, I opened an old box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were birthday cards from my grandmother, handwritten notes, photos from summers at the lake house. Her handwriting grew shakier toward the end, but her words never did. One card read, "I see you, even when others don't." I closed the box and sat with that for a long time. The next morning, I received a message from Mark, the first he'd ever sent me directly. "This is getting out of hand," it read. "You're putting Ava in a difficult position." I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded it to Martin. By September, The tone shifted. The leverage was no longer abstract. The sale of the lake house was officially halted. My name appeared on documents it hadn't touched in years. My father called again. This time, his voice was controlled. "Careful. Let's end this," he said. "It's costing more than it's worth." I thought about all the years it had cost me. "This isn't about worth," I replied. "It's about acknowledgement." He exhaled sharply. "What do you want, Claire?" I answered honestly. "I want my autonomy, and I want it in writing." There was a long silence. "Fine," he said. "We'll sign." After the call ended, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to their moves. I was shaping the outcome, and that scared them more than anger ever could. The signing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October. No ceremony, no family lunch afterward, just signatures, notarization, and the quiet finality of ink on paper. I took the day off work and arrived early, not out of anxiety, but habit. I had spent most of my life arriving early to make myself easier to accommodate. That morning, I arrived early, so no one else could set the tone. The conference room smelled faintly of toner and lemon cleaner. Martin was already there reviewing the final draft. He looked up and gave me a small nod. "This version protects you," he said. "Fully. I read every page anyway." The language was clinical, almost cold. Rights, interests, limitations, transparency requirements, notification clauses. It reduced decades of family history to legal boundaries. That felt appropriate. My parents arrived together again. Ava came last. No one spoke much. Denise distributed pens. The notary checked IDs. My father signed, first his pen pressing harder into the page than necessary. My mother followed her hand, shaking slightly. Ava hesitated, before signing, her eyes flicking toward me, as if waiting for something. I didn't look back. When it was my turn, I signed slowly, deliberately. Claire Whitman. That was the moment. Not when my name was acknowledged in the trust. Not when the sale was halted. Not when they agreed to terms. But when I signed my name, without asking anyone if it was okay. Afterward, there was an awkward pause, like people unsure whether to hug at the end of a meeting that wasn't really a meeting. "We should talk," my mother said softly. I shook my head. "Not today." My father scoffed. "So that's it?" "That's the agreement," I replied. He looked at me like he wanted to say more, then thought better of it. In the elevator down, Ava stood beside me. The doors closed. Silence pressed in. "You didn't have to humiliate us," she said quietly. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't humiliate anyone. I documented reality. She let out a sharp breath. "You always make everything so formal." I turned to her then. "And you always mistake informality for kindness." The elevator doors opened. We walked out in opposite directions. That should have been the end. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, I received a call from an accountant I didn't recognize. He introduced himself politely and said he was reviewing historical filings related to my grandmother's estate. "There are some discrepancies," he said. "I wanted to know if you were aware." My stomach tightened. "What kind of discrepancies?" "Transfers made shortly after her death. Accounts closed. Assets consolidated in ways that don't align with the original trust." I thanked him and hung up, then immediately called Martin. "This could get complicated," he said, after reviewing the information. "Potentially very complicated." The settlement had acknowledged my share going forward, but the past was still murky. "What are my options?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. "We can request a full forensic audit." I stared out my window at the street below. Cars moving. People living their lives, unaware that mine was pivoting again. "What happens if we do that?" I asked. "If there were improprieties," he said, "they'd be exposed. And if there weren't, then you'd know." I thought about my father's insistence on control, my mother's silence, Ava's comfort with the status quo. "I want the audit," I said. Martin nodded. "I thought you might." The request was sent formally. No drama, No accusations. Just a legal right exercised. The reaction was immediate. My mother called first, crying, saying she didn't understand why I couldn't just move on. My father followed furious, accusing me of greed, of tearing the family apart. Ava sent a long message about how this was affecting her marriage, how Mark was angry, how stress wasn't good for her. I read each message once, then I archived them. This wasn't about moving on. It was about accounting. The audit took months. In the meantime, the atmosphere shifted. Invitations resumed awkwardly. A birthday dinner, a holiday brunch, each one felt like a test, a way to see if I would soften. I declined most of them. When I did attend, I watched carefully. At Thanksgiving, my father avoided my eyes. My mother hovered, overly attentive. Ava was polite, but distant. Mark barely spoke to me. The turkey was dry. The conversation strained. No one mentioned the audit. I noticed everything. In December, Martin called again. They found something, he said. My heart rate didn't change. I'd already expected it. What kind of something, I asked. Unauthorized transfers, he replied. Not illegal per se, but questionable, and not disclosed. How much, I asked. He named a number. It was more than I'd imagined. That money, he said carefully, should have been part of the trust. I closed my eyes. So what happens now, I asked. We present the findings, he said, and we see how they respond. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of water and the audit summary printed out in front of me. The facts were clear, the timeline undeniable. I felt no satisfaction, no vindication, just clarity. This wasn't favoritism gone too far. It wasn't oversight. It wasn't grief. It was a choice. They had chosen to secure their version of the future at my expense, assuming I would never look closely enough to notice. They were wrong. The meeting to discuss the audit was scheduled for early January. And this time, there would be no ambiguity. The meeting in January didn't feel like a family gathering. It felt like a reckoning. Same conference room, same table, different energy. This time, my father didn't sit back with crossed arms. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, jaw tight. My mother looked smaller than ever, hands folded, as if she were bracing for impact. Ava arrived with Mark beside her. His presence a new variable I hadn't prepared for. Martin placed the audit summary in front of each of them. No speeches, no preamble, just facts. The silence that followed felt thick, almost physical. My father was the first to speak. "This is misleading," he said, flipping through the pages too quickly to actually read them. These were internal reallocations, perfectly normal. Martin's voice was calm. They weren't disclosed to all beneficiaries. "I handled the trust," my father snapped. "I didn't need permission." "That's not accurate," Martin replied. "And that assumption is the issue." My mother stared at the table. Ava's face had gone pale. Mark finally spoke. "How much are we talking about?" Martin answered. Mark exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. "That's not insignificant." Ava shot him a look. "This isn't your concern." "It is if it affects our finances," he replied evenly. That was new. I watched the dynamic shift in real time. Ava wasn't used to being questioned. Mark wasn't used to being excluded from the truth. My father turned to me. "What do you want, Claire?" I met his gaze steadily. "I want transparency," I said. "And restitution." My mother's head snapped up. "Restitution for the portion of assets that were removed without my knowledge." I clarified. "Plus interest?" "That's absurd," my father barked. "You're talking about dismantling everything." I shook my head. "No, I'm talking about correcting what was taken." Mark rubbed his temples. "Is this why the lake house sale was blocked?" "Yes," Martin said. "And if we don't agree?" Ava asked, her voice tight. Martin answered before I could. "Then this proceeds to court." The word hung in the air. Court. My father's face hardened. "You'd really do that?" I didn't raise my voice. "I already am." The room went quiet again. My mother began to cry. Not softly, not performatively. Just tears she couldn't seem to stop. "I didn't know," she whispered. I swear I didn't know it went this far. I believed her, but belief didn't change the outcome. I'm not blaming you, I said gently, but I am holding you accountable. She nodded, tears falling onto her folded hands. Ava stood abruptly. This is insane, she said. You're tearing us apart over money. I looked at her, then really looked at her. This isn't about money, I said. It's about what the money represents. She laughed bitterly. And what's that? Choice, I replied. Security. Being considered. Mark's eyes flicked to me, then back to Ava. My father slammed his hand on the table. Enough. We'll make an offer. Denise cleared her throat. We'll need time to draft terms. Fine, my father said. But this ends here. I didn't respond, because I knew it wouldn't. 2 weeks later, the offer arrived. It was substantial, but incomplete. A partial repayment. No admission of wrongdoing. A clause requiring confidentiality. Martin reviewed it, then looked at me. This is designed to make you go away, he said. I nodded. Counter it. We did. The second offer was closer. Still flawed. Still protective of my father's reputation. This isn't about reputation, I told Martin. It's about record. We countered again. By March, the tension had spread beyond the room. Ava and Mark began arguing openly. My mother stopped calling altogether. My father sent a single email accusing me of betrayal. I printed it and added it to my file. At work, I stayed focused. Promotions, projects, deadlines. My life didn't pause just because my family was unraveling. One afternoon, Mark called me directly. I didn't know, he said, without preamble. About the trust. About the transfers. I know, I replied. This puts us in a difficult position, he said. Ava's assuming everything will be fine. And you, I asked. There was a pause. I'm not so sure. That told me more than he realized. The third offer came in April. This one included full restitution, interest, an acknowledgement of my share. No confidentiality clause. Martin smiled for the first time in weeks. This is as clean as it gets, he said. I read it twice. Except, I said. The signing was scheduled for early May. No one celebrated. On the day of my father didn't look at me. Ava didn't speak to me. My mother sat between us, trembling. When it was over, something fundamental shifted. Not in them, in me. I didn't feel lighter. I felt grounded. The following week, I transferred the funds into a separate account. One my father had never known about. One that existed solely under my control. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in years. But the story wasn't over. Because when money moves, secrets follow. And one of them was about to surface. The first sign that something else was wrong came in an email I almost deleted. It arrived on a Thursday morning, buried between vendor updates and internal memos. The subject line was plain. Question regarding prior ownership. No urgency, no red flags. It was from a woman named Linda Cho, a compliance officer at a regional bank I'd never done business with. She wrote that during a routine review, connected to the trust restitution transfer, they'd flagged an older account once linked to my grandmother's estate, an account that had been closed years earlier. There are inconsistencies in the documentation, she wrote. We are reaching out to all named parties for clarification. I forwarded it to Martin immediately. This is bigger than the audit, he said after reading it. This suggests parallel structures, meaning I asked. Meaning someone didn't just move assets, he said carefully. They duplicated control. I felt a chill settle in my chest. How? By creating mirror accounts, he replied. It's rare, but not unheard of, especially when someone wants flexibility without oversight. I thought of my father's insistence on handling everything himself, of his irritation whenever I asked questions, of how often he'd dismiss transparency as unnecessary bureaucracy. What do we do? I asked. We wait, Martin said. And we respond carefully. Linda followed up a week later, requesting a formal statement. I provided one through Martin, calm, factual, non-accusatory. Then silence. In the meantime, my family shifted again. Ava stopped speaking to me entirely. Not even curt texts. My mother sent a brief message saying she needed space. My father did nothing. I was fine with that. What I wasn't prepared for was the call from my Uncle Thomas. We weren't close. He lived in Oregon, always pleasant at holidays, never involved. I don't know how to say this. He began, his voice low. But I think you deserve to know. He told me that years ago, shortly after my grandmother's death, he'd overheard my father arguing with someone on the phone. Something about accounts that no one else needed to see. At the time, Thomas had assumed it was business. It bothered me, he said. But I didn't want to cause trouble. I thanked him and hung up my thoughts racing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations. My father's confidence, his certainty that nothing would ever come back to him. Control only works when no one looks too closely. In June, Linda called. "This is informal," she said. "But I wanted to give you a heads up." My stomach tightened. "We found a secondary account," she continued. "Opened shortly after your grandmother's passing. It was funded through internal transfers before the trust consolidation." "Who controlled it?" I asked. There was a pause. "Your father. Sole authority." "And the funds?" I asked. "Substantial," she said. I closed my eyes. "This account was never disclosed," she added. "And its closure coincided with the recent restitution transfer." "He tried to clean it up," I said quietly. "That's our concern," she replied. Martin didn't mince words when I told him. "This could escalate," he said. "From civil to regulatory." "Do I have exposure?" I asked. "No," he replied immediately. "But your father might." I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt a dull ache, because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about who he had chosen to be. The bank initiated a formal inquiry. Notices were sent, requests made. My father called me for the first time in months. "You set this in motion," he said, without greeting. "I didn't create the account," I replied. "You could have let this go," he snapped. "You could have told the truth," I said. Silence. "You want to destroy me," he said finally. I shook my head, though he couldn't see it. "I want you to stop pretending this was about protecting the family." He hung up. Ava called later that night. Her voice was sharp, brittle. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" she demanded. "This could ruin Dad." I took a breath. "I didn't do anything illegal." "You know what I mean," she said. "You pushed. You wouldn't stop." "I asked questions," I replied. "That's not an attack." She laughed bitterly. "You always had to be right." I ended the call. The inquiry moved quickly. Requests for documentation. Interviews. Reviews. My mother left me a voicemail crying, saying she felt sick, saying she wished things could go back to how they were. I didn't call her back, because how they were was built on my silence. In July, Martin met me for lunch. He looked serious. "This may not go to court," he said, "but there will be consequences." "For him," I said. "Yes," he replied. "And ripple effects." I thought about Ava, about Mark, about my mother. "This isn't revenge," I said quietly. Martin nodded. "No, it's accountability." That distinction mattered to me. One afternoon, a letter arrived, addressed to me in my father's handwriting. Inside was a single page. "I never thought you'd go this far. I did what I thought was necessary. You always wanted independence. Now you have it. No apology, no explanation, just distance formalized." I folded the letter and placed it in the file. In August, the bank froze the remaining funds in the secondary account pending resolution. That was the moment I realized something irreversible had happened. Not to my father, to our family. The narrative he'd controlled for decades was unraveling. Not because I shouted, not because I accused, but because I refused to disappear. And the final chapter of this story was approaching faster than any of us expected. The freeze changed everything. It didn't just stop the money. It stopped the pretending. Within days, the calls started. Not to me at first, but around me. Friends asking careful questions, extended family, suddenly remembering my existence. People who had stayed neutral, now trying to figure out which way the wind was blowing. I stayed quiet. That silence wasn't passive anymore. It was deliberate. The first person to come to my door was my mother. She didn't call ahead. She stood in the hallway of my apartment building, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Her purse clutched tightly against her chest, like armor she didn't know how to put down. I let her in. She sat on the edge of the couch, hands folded, eyes darting around, as if expecting someone else to appear. I didn't know, she said again. I swear I didn't. I believed her. That didn't mean I excused her. You didn't want to know, I replied gently. She flinched. I was afraid, she said. After your grandmother died, everything felt unstable. Your father, he took over. I let him. I nodded. I know. That surprised her. I see it now, I continued. But seeing it doesn't undo it. She nodded slowly, tears spilling over. He says you're doing this to punish him. I met her eyes. I'm doing this so it doesn't keep happening. She pressed her lips together. What happens next? I don't know, I said honestly. But I won't intervene. That was the hardest sentence I'd ever spoken. She stayed for less than an hour. No hugs, no promises, just the quiet acknowledgement that something had ended. 2 days later, Ava showed up. This time she didn't pretend. This is on you, she said the moment she walked in. Mark is furious. Dad's accounts are frozen. We don't know what's going to happen. I waited. You could fix this, she continued. You could tell them it was a misunderstanding. I shook my head. There was no misunderstanding. Her voice cracked. He's our father, and he was my legal guardian, I replied. That comes with responsibility. She paced the room. You always needed things spelled out. Always needed control. I watched her, really watched her. No, I said. I needed honesty. She stopped pacing and looked at me like she didn't recognize me. When did you become like this, she asked. When I stopped asking for permission, I replied. She left angry. Not slammed door angry. Worse. Cold. That night, Mark emailed me. Not accusatory. Not emotional. Direct. If this goes further, Ava and I may need to reevaluate our financial position. I don't expect you to intervene, but I want you to know there will be consequences. I read it twice, then close my laptop. Consequences had always existed. They'd just never been shared evenly. In September, the bank completed its review. The findings were forwarded to regulatory authorities, not with my name attached, but with my father's. Martin called me that afternoon. He's being required to account for everything he said. Years of documentation. And if he can't, I asked. There will be penalties, he replied. Possibly more. I didn't ask how severe. It wasn't my role. My role was to decide how much access they still had to me. I blocked my father's number that day. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't announce it. I didn't write a letter. I just removed his ability to reach me. Ava sent one final message. You got what you wanted. I hope it was worth it. I stared at it for a long time. Then I replied, I got what was taken. There's a difference. After that, nothing. October passed quietly. I focused on work, on friends, on building a life that no longer revolved around reaction. For the first time, the holidays approached without dread. In November, I hosted Thanksgiving for friends, chosen family, people who asked questions and listened to the answers. The table was mismatched, the food imperfect, the atmosphere warm. At one point, someone raised a glass and said, I'm grateful for clarity. I smiled, thinking of how long it had taken me to understand what that word really meant. In December, my mother sent a card, just her name, no return address, no message. I placed it on my desk and left it there. On Christmas morning, I woke up without anxiety. No checking social media, no bracing for disappointment. I made coffee. I sat by the window. I breathed. The phone rang once, a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Later I listened. It was my father. His voice sounded older, tired. "I don't know what comes next," he said, "but I hope someday you'll understand why I did what I did." I deleted the message. Understanding didn't require access. As the year closed, I felt something unfamiliar. Not victory, relief, because the most important boundary I'd set wasn't legal. It was personal, and once set, it couldn't be undone. January came quietly, like it didn't want to draw attention to itself. No court dates, no urgent calls, just the slow, deliberate shift of life settling into a new shape. I had expected fallout, drama, some final confrontation that would tie everything together neatly. Instead, what arrived was something far more unsettling. Space. The regulatory process moved forward without me. Martin updated me when necessary, but there was nothing for me to do. My father's accounts remained restricted. Interviews were conducted, records examined, outcomes pending. I was no longer at the center of it. That should have felt like relief. Instead, it forced me to face a question I'd been avoiding. Who was I without the conflict? For most of my adult life, my sense of self had been shaped by resistance, by being the reasonable one, the overlooked one, the one who kept going quietly while others took up space. Now that the struggle had shifted away from me, I had to sit with what remained. I threw myself into work at first. Long hours, extra projects. I welcomed the distraction until one evening my manager asked if everything was okay. "You've already proven yourself," she said gently. "You don't have to outrun anything here." That landed harder than I expected. I realized then how deeply the need to justify my presence had seeped into every part of my life. In February, I made a decision that had nothing to do with my family. I applied for a leadership role in a different division, a position that would require a move, new responsibilities, new risks. 6 months earlier, I would have hesitated, worried about timing, about how it would look, about whether it would disrupt the fragile balance with my parents. Now, none of that applied. When I got the offer, I accepted without asking anyone's opinion. The move was scheduled for April. I didn't tell my family. I told my friends, my colleagues, people who had earned the right to know where I was going. The apartment hunt was exhausting, but grounding. Each showing felt like a declaration of independence. I chose a place based on light and quiet, not proximity to anyone else's expectations. While packing, I found old photos I'd forgotten about. Me at 10, standing beside my grandmother at the lake house. Me at 17, awkward and hopeful. Me at 22, smiling too hard at a family dinner. I kept a few. I let the rest go. In March, my mother called. I almost didn't answer. Her voice was softer than I remembered. "I heard you might be moving." I paused. "Yes." She hesitated. "You didn't tell me." I didn't know how I replied. "That was true. I'd like to see you before you go," she said. Not a demand, not an expectation, a request. I thought about it for a long moment. "Okay," I said. We met at a small cafe halfway between our homes. Neutral ground again. A pattern I'd come to appreciate. She looked older, not in a dramatic way, just less protected. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said quickly. "I know I don't get to ask for that." I nodded. "I just wanted to say," she continued, "that I see now how much you carried alone." The words were imperfect, late, but they were real. "Thank you," I said. She reached across the table, then stopped herself. I appreciated that restraint. When we parted, there was no embrace, just a quiet understanding that this was what connection looked like now. In April, I moved. New city, new routines, new anonymity. No one there knew my family history. No one had expectations of who I was supposed to be. That freedom was intoxicating. In May, Ava sent a message. I hadn't heard from her in months. Dad accepted a settlement with the regulators. It's over. I read the message once, then again. I'm ask for details. I replied simply, "I hope you're okay." She didn't respond. That was enough. By summer, the story had faded into the background of my life. Not erased, integrated. I no longer checked for updates. I no longer replayed conversations in my head. The anger had burned itself out, leaving something quieter in its place. Clarity. One evening, sitting on the balcony of my new apartment, watching the city lights come on, I realized something important. I hadn't won. I had reclaimed. There was no triumph in that, just alignment. I thought about my grandmother then, about how she'd always encouraged me to pay attention, to notice patterns, to trust my instincts, even when others dismissed them. She had known, and now finally so did I. The past hadn't disappeared. It had been placed where it belonged, behind me. The message from Ava lingered longer than I expected, not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't. No accusations, no defensiveness, no attempt to pull me back into the orbit I'd escaped. Just a statement, a period at the end of a sentence that had stretched across our entire adult lives. It's over. I didn't feel relief. I felt recalibration. When something ends cleanly, without drama or reconciliation, you're left alone with the truth. And the truth was this: the conflict had never been the center of my life. It had only been loud enough to distract me from what I actually wanted. I began to notice how often I'd made decisions based on proximity to family. Jobs chosen for convenience. Apartments selected because they were close enough. Holidays planned around availability instead of desire. All of that was gone now. In June, I received a formal notice from Martin, confirming the regulatory settlement. No charges that required my involvement. No further action needed. My name was not mentioned once. He added a short note at the end. "You're free of this." I closed the email and sat back in my chair, letting the words settle. Free was an unfamiliar feeling. Not dramatic, not euphoric, more like standing still after a long period of bracing yourself against wind and realizing it had stopped. I didn't celebrate. I went for a walk. That summer, my life took on a quieter rhythm. Mornings with coffee and light filtering through the kitchen window. Evenings reading on the balcony. Weekends spent exploring a city that didn't know my history. People asked questions sometimes. About my family. About where I was from. I answered honestly but briefly. "We're not close." That sentence no longer carried weight. It didn't need justification. In July, Mark reached out again. This time, his message was different. "Ava's having a hard time. She doesn't say it, but I see it. I just wanted you to know." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "I know what it's like to have a hard time without anyone noticing." He responded a few minutes later. "I think I understand that now. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't offer solutions. Understanding, I'd learned, was not the same as responsibility." A week later, my mother sent another card. This one had a short note inside. "I hope you're happy where you are. No guilt, no pressure, just a hope." I placed it in a drawer with the others. In August, something unexpected happened. I was invited to speak at a leadership workshop for women in my industry. The organizer said she'd heard about my work ethic, my ability to navigate complexity, my calm under pressure. I almost declined. Old instinct. Don't draw attention. Don't step forward unless invited explicitly. Then I stopped myself. I accepted. Standing in front of that room, I didn't talk about my family. I talked about boundaries, about clarity, about how being agreeable is often mistaken for being weak, and how dangerous that assumption can be. Afterward, a woman approached me, late 50s, sharp eyes. I needed to hear that she said, "I've spent my life being the easy one." I smiled. "It costs more than people realize." She nodded. "Until you stop paying." That conversation stayed with me. In September, Ava called. No warning, no text beforehand. I answered on the third ring. "Hi," she said. Her voice sounded different, quieter. "Hi," I replied. There was a pause. Then she exhaled. "I don't know how to talk to you," she said. I appreciated the honesty. "You don't have to," I replied. "Unless you want to." Another pause. "I'm angry," she said. "And I don't know who to be angry at." I considered my response carefully. "That's not something I can help you with," I said. "But I hope you figure it out." She didn't argue. "I used to think you left because you didn't care," she said softly. "Now I think you left because you did." I closed my eyes. "That's close enough," I said. We didn't talk long. No apologies, no resolution. But when the call ended, I felt something loosen. Not forgiveness. Perspective. October arrived with a cooler air and shorter days. My life felt full, but not crowded. Intentional. One evening, as I reorganized my bookshelf, I found a notebook I hadn't opened in years. Inside were old lists, goals, plans, things I'd wanted but never pursued because they felt impractical. One of them stood out. Take a sabbatical. I laughed quietly. Then I checked my calendar. It was possible. In November, I submitted the request. Approved. As Thanksgiving approached, I received one last message from my father. No voice, no emotion. "I've been advised not to contact you further. I hope you find what you're looking for." I read it once. Then I archived it because I already had. The sabbatical began on a gray Monday morning in December. No farewell party, no speeches. I closed my laptop, handed over my projects, and walked out of the office, carrying nothing but my bag, in a sense of quiet intention. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't moving towards something specific. I was moving away from obligation. I rented a small house along the northern coast. Not a vacation rental. Something simple. Wood floors, worn smooth by time. A fireplace that actually worked. Windows that let the sound of the ocean seep in without asking permission. I told almost no one where I was going. The first week I slept. Long, uninterrupted nights. Mornings without alarms. I cooked slowly. Walked along the beach even when the weather was bad. Especially when the weather was bad. Without distraction, the memories came back differently. Not as sharp flashes, but as layered impressions. The way my father used to praise my maturity when I didn't complain. How my mother equated peace with silence. How Ava learned early that attention was currency. I saw it clearly now. The family dynamic hadn't been broken. It had been efficient, designed to reward those who took up space and penalize those who adapted. I had adapted too well. One afternoon, as I was sorting through emails, I'd ignored for weeks. A message from Martin caught my eye. "Just checking in. No action required, but something came up you should be aware of." I called him. "Your father has formally resigned from several boards," he said. Stepped down quietly. I waited. "There's talk of health issues," he added. "Stress-related." I looked out the window at the waves breaking against the rocks. "How does that make you feel?" he asked. I considered the question honestly. "Sad," I said, "but not responsible." "That's a healthy distinction," he replied. We talked briefly about logistics, about ensuring nothing further required my involvement. Then we hung up. That night, I built a fire and sat watching it burn down to embers. I thought about how often I'd been told that family meant sacrifice, that loyalty meant endurance, that love meant staying even when it hurt. No one had ever mentioned consent. In January, my mother sent another message. "He's not well. I don't know what to do." I stared at the screen for a long time. This was the moment I'd anticipated, without admitting it, the test of whether my boundaries were real or conditional. I replied carefully, "I'm sorry he's struggling. I hope he gets the support he needs." Nothing more. She didn't respond. The days passed quietly. I started writing again. Not journaling, something else. Observations, scenes, conversations that had shaped me. Not for anyone else, just to see them clearly on the page. One morning, while walking the beach, I ran into an older woman collecting driftwood. We talked idly about the weather, about the tides. At one point, she said, "It's easier to carry less when you stop picking things up out of habit." I smiled. She didn't know how precisely that applied. In February, Ava emailed, "Dad's condition stabilized. He wants to talk to you." I closed the laptop without responding. It wasn't cruelty. It was discernment. I wasn't ready. And readiness wasn't something I owed anyone on demand. By March, the sabbatical had done its work. I felt rested, reoriented, no longer braced for impact. I returned to the city briefly to handle practical matters. During that time, I ran into Mark by chance at a grocery store. We stood awkwardly near the produce section, neither of us quite sure what to say. "He asks about you," Mark said finally. "I'm sure he does," I replied. "I don't think he expected you to walk away completely," he said. I met his gaze. Neither did I. That was the truth. In April, my mother called. This time I answered. Her voice was tired. "I don't know how to be in the middle anymore," she said. "You don't have to be," I replied. Silence. "I miss you," she said quietly. I closed my eyes. "I miss the idea of you," I said. "The version of you I needed." She didn't argue. We talked for 10 minutes. No history, no future, just the present. When the call ended, I felt no rush of emotion, just a sense of completion. The sabbatical ended in May. I returned to work with clarity and limits I hadn't had before. I delegated. I said no. I chose projects that mattered. One afternoon, my manager asked if I wanted to take on a more visible leadership role. I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said, because this time, visibility didn't feel like risk. It felt like alignment. The call came in late June, on a Wednesday evening, when the city was heavy with heat and impatience. I knew who it was before I answered. My mother's voice was unsteady. "He passed this morning." I closed my eyes, letting the words land, without rushing to meet them with anything else. "I'm sorry," I said. She waited as if expecting more. "Something softer, something absolving. He asked for you," she added. I didn't respond right away. "He said he wanted to explain," she continued. "He said he made mistakes." I took a slow breath. "I hope he found some peace." That was the most honest thing I could offer. The funeral was held a week later. Small, controlled, carefully curated, just as he would have wanted. I debated whether to go. In the end, I decided I would. Not for him, for myself. The chapel was quiet when I arrived. Muted colors, familiar faces aged by time and discomfort. People nodded at me, unsure how to place me now. I wasn't the compliant daughter. I wasn't the antagonist either. I was something they hadn't rehearsed for. Ava stood near the front, dressed impeccably, her face composed in a way that felt practiced. Mark was beside her, one hand resting on her back like an anchor. My mother sat alone in the first row. I chose a seat near the aisle, halfway back. The service followed the usual rhythm. Stories of leadership, of sacrifice, of a man who did what he thought was best. No mention of the damage, no acknowledgement of the cost. I listened without reacting. At one point, the officiant spoke about family legacy, about how what we leave behind shapes those who come after us. I felt a quiet certainty settle in me. Legacies are not inherited. They're examined. After the service, people gathered in the reception hall. Coffee, finger food, polite conversations orbiting around grief without touching it. Ava approached me first. "I didn't think you'd come," she said. "I didn't know if I would," I replied. She nodded. "He talked about you near the end." I met her eyes. "What did he say?" She hesitated. "That you were stubborn. That you always needed things your own way." I almost smiled. "That sounds like him," I said. She frowned. "That's it. That's enough," I replied. She studied me as if searching for something to push against. Then she sighed. "I don't know how to do this without him," she admitted quietly. I believed her. You'll figure it out, I said. Or you won't. Either way, it's yours now. She didn't respond. My mother approached later. Her face looked drawn fragile in a way I hadn't seen before. He left you something, she said. I felt my body tense, then settle again. It's not what you think, she added quickly. A letter. I nodded. I'll read it when I'm ready. She handed me an envelope, my name written in his precise handwriting. We stood there for a moment, suspended between past and present. I should have protected you, she said, barely above a whisper. Yes, I replied. She flinched, but didn't argue. I didn't know how, she added. I know, I said. That was the closest we'd come to truth in years. I left early. At home that night, I placed the envelope on the table and stared at it for a long time before opening it. The letter was short, no grand confession, no apology. He wrote about pressure, about responsibility, about how fear had shaped his choices. He said he believed order mattered more than fairness. That control was how he kept things from falling apart. At the end, he wrote one line. I hope one day you'll see that I did this because I loved you. I folded the letter and set it aside. Love without consent is not love. It's management. I didn't feel anger, or grief, or relief. I felt clarity. The following weeks were quiet again. Ava and I exchanged a few logistical messages. Nothing personal, nothing cruel, just coordination. My mother called once, asking if we could have lunch sometime. Maybe I said, we'll see. That wasn't a no. It wasn't a promise. It was honesty. By August, I had fully stepped into my new role at work. I led differently than I had before. Direct, transparent, unafraid of discomfort. People noticed. One afternoon, a younger colleague stopped by my office. How do you stay so calm when things get tense? She asked. I considered the question. Because I don't confuse tension with danger anymore, I said. That felt true. As summer faded into fall, I found myself thinking less about what I'd lost and more about what I'd gained. Not money, not validation, agency, the ability to choose my response, my access, my future. The past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer dictated the terms. And that was everything. The first Christmas, after my father's death, arrived without ceremony. No dramatic reckoning, no sudden reconciliation, just a date on the calendar that used to carry weight and now felt neutral. I spent it the way I wanted to. I stayed in the city. I declined invitations that felt obligatory and accepted one that felt genuine. A small dinner with friends who knew my story in fragments, not as a defining feature, but as background context. People who didn't ask me to perform gratitude or forgiveness on command. The table was crowded, the conversation loud. Someone burned the rolls. Someone else forgot the wine. It was imperfect and warm and entirely uncurated. Halfway through the night, I realized something quietly profound. I wasn't bracing for anything. No phone calls I didn't want to answer. No social media posts I had to avoid. No sense that I was missing a place I didn't belong to anymore. Later, when I walked home, alone under cold streetlights, I felt steady, not numb, not triumphant, grounded. In January, I received the final confirmation from Martin. The estate was closed. No further actions required. My name appeared where it should have, from the beginning, documented and unambiguous. We met for coffee one last time. You handled this well, he said. Most people don't. I didn't handle it, I replied. I stopped absorbing it. He smiled. That might be the same thing. I thought about that on the walk home. Absorbing, carrying, adjusting myself to accommodate systems that were never designed with my consent in mind. I'd mistaken endurance for virtue for a long time. I didn't anymore. In February, Ava and I met briefly to finalize a few remaining personal items. Photos, keepsakes, things our parents had left behind. We moved carefully around each other, like two people navigating a room that still held sharp edges. At one point, she held up an old photo of us as children, standing beside our grandmother at the lake house. "I forgot how close we used to be," she said. "We were," I replied, "before roles replaced relationships." She nodded slowly. "I don't know how to undo that." "You don't have to undo it," I said. "You just have to stop repeating it." She looked at me, then really looked at me. "I don't think I ever knew how much you were giving up," she said. I met her gaze. "I don't think you were supposed to." We parted without resolution, but without hostility. That was enough. My relationship with my mother remained cautious. Occasional calls, neutral lunches, conversations anchored firmly in the present. She no longer tried to explain the past. I no longer needed her to. In March, I was asked to mentor a small group of women entering leadership roles. The sessions were informal, honest, focused on decision-making under pressure. During one meeting, someone asked how to handle family expectations when they conflict with personal values. I paused before answering. "You don't negotiate boundaries with people who benefit from you having none," I said. "You set them. Then you live with the consequences." There was silence after that, then nods. By spring, my life felt intentional, in a way it never had before. I wasn't reacting. I wasn't compensating. I wasn't proving anything. I was choosing how much access people had to me, choosing which traditions mattered, choosing when to engage and when to step back. The revenge, if anyone wanted to call it that, wasn't dramatic. There was no public humiliation, no shouting match, no final confrontation that ended with applause. The revenge was quiet. It was refusing to be erased. It was documenting the truth when others relied on silence. It was reclaiming what was taken without begging for acknowledgement. And most of all, it was walking away without waiting for permission. One evening, months later, I found myself standing on my balcony, watching the city settle into night. Lights flickered on. Cars moved steadily below. Life continuing. I thought about the younger version of myself, the one who thought love meant compliance, who believed being easy would keep her safe. She didn't know better. I do now. Family is not the people who control the narrative. It's the people who respect your autonomy within it. Love is not endurance. It's choice. And boundaries are not punishment. They are information. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been the one who stayed quiet to keep the peace, the one who was excluded because you didn't fit the script, know this: you are not difficult for wanting clarity. You are not disloyal for protecting yourself. And you are not wrong for choosing dignity over approval. If you found meaning in this story, I invite you to like, comment, and subscribe. Share it with someone who might need to hear that walking away can be an act of strength, not failure. Sometimes the most powerful justice isn't payback. It's reclaiming your life and never shrinking again.